it's about control, and they'd rather have control than anything else. So even if it's at the detriment of like, oh no, well, there's a pandemic now, everything's, the supply chain is shut down. We'll have to make do. I mean, they just would rather have control
Well,
than
absolutely. But just what you said there, Kim, actually, it just occurred to me. All the better if the people are suffering and there's a lack of food or there's a bit of crisis, because crisis is perfect because you just step in and say, well, this just shows you need our environmental plan, you need our whatever.
right.
So COVID showed it and everything else shows it. It's problem, reaction, solution. So if you allow a financial crisis to develop, well, then you can step in and say, look, we're going to give everyone 10,000 CBDC credits and we're going to fix the problem for you. So they actually want crises, shortages, and anxiety in the population because that's how, for all of human history, way back to the Roman Empire, Shaka Zulu in Africa, it was always the same thing. You've got the guys at the top, they've got a plan, and they make sure that there's fear and anxiety that
Yeah.
then they can come in and help fix it.
Well, it's
It's the oldest trick
enslavement,
in the
right?
book.
Right, it's a form of enslavement of saying, "Well,
Yeah.
you're at my behest, like, you must if you wanna survive." Um, do you think that a lot of I see a lot of people on social media and commentators talking about how this is like a communist agenda or some sort of like a Marxist agenda. Do you think it's a Marxist agenda, or do you think that this is a? Because I view it and I don't really see it as like some big Marxist agenda. I just view it as the power hungry have realized how to gain power, right? We don't live in fiefdoms anymore with kings that are over the peasants. They have a new, so they have to figure out, okay, well then how do we control people? How do we keep them under our control? And especially with the growing population, and that this is just really, they figured out, well, that was just the best method, an effective method of keeping people under their thumb.
Yeah, it's basically just an ideological story. So these things like Marxism and fascism, they're just stories that you sell to the masses. And you make sure the story is told in such a way as you are key in saving them or helping them, or this is what we need for fairness and equity, whatever nonsense you want. The Marxist ideas, they are essentially just a story of we're all going to be better off, we'll all share with each other, and no one will become a big kingpin. But all you do is you hijack these nonsense stories of utopia, utopian stories. You
Right.
hijack them and you tell them to the people while you sit and rule over the whole thing. So the story doesn't say there's a tiny percentage of people who are going to run an ant farm here. Of course it doesn't. It says we're all going to be in a utopia where we all accept everyone and there's no, violence and granny is safe from the flu and all this other crap, right?
Hmm.
It's a story. And Professor Matthias Desmet called it the narrative. You inject the narrative, and if you keep repeating it enough, and they've certainly repeated the Marxist nonsense they're coming out with the last few years, keep repeating it. And after a while, people just assume it's true because
Yeah.
everyone's saying it. So it must be
Right.
true. That's how our brain works. And one quick thing for the audience, though, there's this debate about Marxism, and then other people are saying they're fascist, and other people are saying, but they're communist. They're all of those things, but they're only stories. They're only ways of viewing the world. So fascism was defined by Mussolini, the perfect definition. He said fascism should really be called corporatism, for it is the alliance of corporate and state power. And that's what fascism is. It's not guys in boots and neo-Nazis. That National Socialism in Germany, Nazism, fascism supposedly was actually National Socialism. So
Hmm.
the bad guy brought in all the unions and brought in all the industry, and he joined together all the unions and the industry and the state in a totalitarian system. And in Russia, they brought in all and centralized all the industry, and they had a totalitarian state. So people need to understand they're all largely the same totalitarian system. It's only that their stories are a little bit different, but at the end of the day, the end goal's the same.
Yeah.
And the rich plutocrats, the ultra capitalist rich, ironically, this is what confuses people. They use Marxist and communist stories and they push them down to the masses to cover for what they're really doing, which is
Right.
creating a totalitarian system. And I think
Totally.
that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, and I think people should be very, very wary about this whole, "Oh, it's Marxism, it's a Marxist agenda," because they will flip that narrative on a dime. The minute they
Yeah,
see that the population is no longer buying the Marxism, they'll just
yeah,
flip the narrative, right? And they'll just use something else. And that's what they did even this year at Davos. They said, "Well, libertarians are
yeah.
causing a problem." And
That's
so
it.
they started to even use language and have meetings at Davos that were meant to try to rebuild trust, right? They even said it was rebuilding trust this year. And they'll say, "Oh, okay, you're right. We're not going to do CBDCs. We're not going to do this. Whatever it is that people are rejecting." And they just reframe it, repackage it so that people
That's
gobble it up. And they'll just get the other side next time. They'll figure it out psychologically. Like, how do we get these others? So yeah, I think you're right.
it.
It's about totalitarianism. It's not about anything else. They're
Mm.
just spoon feeding us whatever nonsense, and people should
That
be wary of that.
Yeah, and it's quite clever nonsense. In fairness, it
Yes,
fools most of the people,
it
but at
does.
the same time, the funny thing is when you've actually become awake to it. The irony is, and I've said this the last few years since COVID, what really gets me and still fascinates me is the nonsense is quite simply self-evidently nonsense from COVID through to all the other stuff. You don't have to spend more than a few hours on climate data to see that it's utterly outrageous.
Right.
But if you've got the media ownership and you've got a master plan and you've got countless NGOs and organizations at a high level, massively funded to drive nonsense, to the majority, the nonsense sounds quite correct and logical. And there's one joke just as you were speaking, Kim, there, what you were saying, I thought it was one of the funniest ones. And it shows a supermarket kind of with all vegetables or whatever, and someone has photoshopped it, and they have a little sign: people who bought this and they have the virus also bought this and they have a Ukraine flag and they also have, I think, an Israel flag. But it
Right.
doesn't matter what the scam is. I know a lot of these things are tragic. Don't get me wrong. Like
Right.
the Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine is a meat
Sure.
grinder. But people need to remember these are all just parts of a chess game. And the guys at the top don't care about 500,000 civilians dying. They honestly don't care. And just to illustrate, I'll have to just quickly say this. I know this for a fact that they don't care at all about civilians dying in huge numbers. And you only have to go to the fully documented case of the Iraq War. Everyone knows, and it was in the main media before they were bought off. Everyone knows that was a scam. It was about power and geopolitical leverage. Everyone knows it was a scam. And also, the BBC in the UK published the best estimate of civilians and people dying in the Iraq War, the big one, was around 400 to 500,000 people. And that was men, women, and children. So the people who drove that known scam and used propaganda to get it through and fired journalists who questioned it, uh, they knew hundreds of thousands of innocent people would die. They knew that for a fact. And we know for a fact because they did it. The people at the top do not care. And I think that's something that ordinary people find hard to believe. Yeah, but all these statespeople and people up the top, surely they couldn't not care at all about hundreds of thousands of people dying. But that's so terrible. They keep telling us about virtue and saving granny. How could they not care? Well, I've just given you the proof. Iraq War. We know
Yeah.
for a fact they don't care.
Right.
That's it.
And nobody was punished for that. It was just,
No one.
in fact, a lot they were promoted. People who
Yeah.
went on further in their careers. I mean, it's just a total and complete sham.